بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson number 15 in our series on Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah, and in the previous lesson, lesson 14, we completed our discussion of the dialogue that we have with the Ash'aris, those who say they are Ash'aris, and they are the ones who affirm 7 attributes by way of reason. So the way they affirm these attributes is upon aql, upon reason, and that's the primary basis. And so in the section that we completed, there were 5 points that Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah mentioned as a response to them very quickly. First of all, to return back to reason, to make reason to be the foundation for establishing these attributes, opposes the way of the Salaf, first of all. Number 2, to return to reason and to make it the foundation itself opposes reason. It contradicts reason, because reason informs us that something which is unseen, we cannot have detailed knowledge of that which is unseen, in this case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, until He reveals knowledge of Himself. So this in itself opposes reason. This type of information or knowledge is acquired only through revelation, in principle that is. We're not denying that reason can figure out some of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not denying that. The issue here is making it a foundation, a principle, which is what they do. Thirdly, that if you make reason to be the basis of speaking about what can be affirmed for Allah and what cannot be affirmed for Allah, then this will inevitably lead to differing, contradiction, incoherence, splitting, and every person coming with his own reason and saying, well, I think Allah cannot be described with this, or I think Allah can be described with this. Right? If you make reason to be the basis. And this is indeed what we see, because among the people of Kalam, among the people who entered into this way of speaking about Allah and deriving their creed, we see that all of them, we have the Jahmiyyah, we have the Mu'tazila, and we have the Kullabiyah, we have the Ash'aris, Maturidis, and then even among themselves, among the Mu'tazila are different groups, right? And among the Ash'aris and Maturidis, there are those who affirm some attributes, and there are others who actually negate those very same attributes. This is a clear proof to show that making reason to be the foundation is futile and false, right? Because that which is truth can never have any incoherence or contradiction. So this was the third point that the Shaykh mentioned. The fourth point that we covered in the previous lesson is how they deal with the texts of the attributes that they do not agree with, right? And so they treat these texts with metaphorical interpretation or an allegorical interpretation. This was never the way of the companions or the way of the Salaf. So we illustrated how they basically go around in a circle. So the example that the Shaykh gave, that the Ash'aris do not affirm the attribute of love for Allah. Allah does not love. And why is that? What does this return back to? Well, it goes back to Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and those kind of Greek philosophers. And they said that the first cause or the prime mover does not have body, parts, or passions. And passions here meaning things like love, things like being pleased, things like being angry, right? So all of these groups of kalam, they inherited that philosophy and that kalam. And so when they came to the Quran and the Sunnah and they see that Allah, for example, is pleased with the believers, or Allah becomes angry with the people of disbelief or the people of sin, or with the Yahud or whatever, and they see that Allah loves the muhsineen, right? Allah loves the ones who do right, who do goodness. And so they look at these texts through the lens of that kalam and that philosophy, and they say, well, this is a passion. So this word here, Allah's pleasure, Allah's rida, or Allah's mahabba, this cannot really be mahabba, right? So then they have approaches as to how they deal with these texts. And so one of them is they say, well, okay, it's not really mahabba, it really means irada, it means the intent or the desire to reward. So they explain it away as irada. And as the Shaykh explained, all you've done is you fled from one thing, trying to escape something, and then you've gone to another thing, and you haven't escaped the thing you were trying to flee from. Because if you say Allah having pleasure or Allah having love implies that He is like the created beings, because created beings are the ones who have passions and things like that, and then you say it means irada, it means Allah's desire or will or wish, then the same thing applies here. You haven't escaped what you were trying to flee from, because the desire or the wish is something that we find amongst created beings. So why is mahabba or pleasure, for example, not befitting Allah, even though Allah Himself ascribed that to Himself, yet irada is, and irada is a wish or a desire. So this is a contradiction. And then after that they say, well, no, irada means reward. It means the actual reward itself. And so, again, this is just kind of linguistic messing around with words. Because if you say Allah's love is the actual reward, which is other than Allah, so in this case, Allah's irada, Allah's love is His irada, and when you explain, well, that is equally prohibited according to your principles, then they say, well, no, it actually means reward. And reward is the created thing, which is the actual reward. So in other words, Allah's mahabba is actually paradise. Right? So Allah's love is not an attribute established with Allah, rather it is paradise. And so therefore Allah's love becomes in the same way as we say Allah's house, Baytullah, the Kaaba. Right? It's a created thing, but we ascribe it to Allah. Or we say Rasulullah, we say the messenger of Allah. The messenger is created, but we ascribe him to Allah. So in the same way, Mahabbatullah is not an attribute established with Allah, it is something created that is annexed, that belongs to Allah in that sense. So in that case, if there's a reward, then Allah is the creator of that reward. And if Allah created the reward, then He must have desired to create the reward. And if He desired to reward, then He could only have done so out of love for the one He wants to reward. So you haven't escaped what you are really trying to flee from, right? So why are you going playing all of these games, and why don't you just say at the very beginning, say Allah has love, and that love befits His majesty, and it is unlike the love that we have and experience in the creation. Why don't you say that from the beginning? And leave the text as it is, and maintain the sanctity of the text, and remove this burden of sin that you are putting upon yourself by, playing these games with philosophy and kalam, and, as if you are implying that Allah did not know that by affirming this attribute He was going to confuse His creation. And that as if Allah did not know that if He ascribed pleasure and love and anger to Himself, this is going to violate the 10 categories of Aristotle. Right? So you see, this entails with it as well, it's like really having a very evil perception towards the revealed texts. Anyhow, this was the example that was given by Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen to illustrate how basically when they try to make a ta'wil, or when they try to give a figurative explanation for the attribute they do not accept, then the thing that they're trying to flee from, they fall into it again. And they just end up going in a long round circle, until they are forced to come to the position to say, well, we affirm Allah's love just as we affirm His hearing and seeing, and we say we don't know the how of that, and it befits Allah's majesty. What, you should have just said the same thing as you do with knowledge, hearing, power, the other attributes that you affirm. And that was point number 4 in a nutshell. And point number 5 was that yes, it returns back to this issue. They say, well, if we affirm these attributes, it necessitates resemblance and likeness. And then we say, well, the same thing applies to Allah's life, Allah's speech, Allah's hearing, Allah's seeing. How can you affirm Allah's hearing and seeing and say, well, this does not resemble that of the creation? And then you say, well, Allah's love and other attributes that you deny, that, they say, well, this, necessitates tashbih. This is a contradiction in applying your principles. So anyhow, the Shaykh went through the kind of response and the answer to all of that, and we covered that in some detail, and we finished by saying the thing that we finished with in the previous lesson was to say that even the attributes that you do affirm, which is hearing and seeing, we find among the Ash'aris are those who find these attributes to be problematic, right? Hearing and seeing. Why are they problematic? Because hearing and seeing, remember, they are operating on the basis of the Aristotelian idea, which is the maker or the first cause or the prime mover is really just an abstract idea. He is immutable, he never changes. It is like a static deity which doesn't have any actions, which obviously doesn't have any will and doesn't have any actions. They've got this notion like this. And this is why they deny that Allah has actions tied to His will. They deny that Allah has actions tied to His will. And on that basis, they deny, many of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, including love and anger and pleasure and things like that. So hearing and seeing, as we said, that if Allah did not create the creation, there's no creation, then He creates the creation, then Allah is now seeing the creation that He wasn't seeing before He created the creation, even though He had knowledge of it. This would imply, according to their principles, a change in Allah's essence. Something has changed with Allah, right? In His attribute or in His essence, which they don't allow. So for that reason, some of the Ash'aris and they realized these attributes actually pose a problem for us, which is hearing and seeing and even speech, kalam, speech, because if Allah speaks, then we know Allah spoke the Quran to Jibreel, and He spoke to Musa alayhi salam, and He will speak to the believers on the Day of Judgment, but He will speak with speech that He never spoke before creating any of these entities. This would therefore imply a change in Allah's essence. So how can you now affirm speech as, right? So some among the Ash'aris, they say, well, hearing and seeing isn't really hearing and seeing, it's actually knowledge, it's ilm, right? So they refer these two attributes back to ilm. And likewise, kalam, speech. The kalam is not really kalam. Kalam is just like something, a meaning in the self. So then they basically deviate from what the Arabs know and understand to be kalam, what is actual kalam, right? So the point being that even the 7 that the Ash'aris they affirm, they don't really affirm these attributes, right? And if you were to follow the rationale and the principles, if they were to be honest to the principles, you would find that they would start gravitating in this way towards the Mu'tazila, towards the Jahmiyyah, and towards the philosophers, right? If they were to be honest, and if they were to apply their principles consistently and truthfully, they would have to, start gravitating in that direction. They don't affirm Allah's speech as in reality. They don't affirm Allah's hearing in reality. They don't affirm Allah's seeing in reality, because these would contradict their principles if they were to apply them honestly and truthfully. So there's 3 attributes gone. And even irada, what they affirm is not really irada. So once you start digging and looking into all of the philosophical gymnastics that you find in the books of the Ash'aris, as they try to juggle with these problems, then you will see that really there's hardly any attribute apart from maybe life and power that they kind of really and knowledge, let's say, that they affirm, and even they can be problematic. This is why, as we said to you before, all of these groups are arguing against each other. And so the Mu'tazila, they have strong arguments against the Ash'aris, right? They have strong arguments that the Ash'aris cannot respond to. And they even admit this in their books. That this argument that the Ash'aris say to us, they say to us, for example, well, hang on, you say that hearing and seeing is synonymous with knowledge. So why don't you then do the same thing with all the attributes? Why don't you say that all the attributes are just really synonymous with one attribute, which is synonymous with Allah's essence, right? So anyhow, the point being, I don't want to go into too much, but the general point being is that the Ash'aris, who are the closest to the people of the Sunnah because they affirm the most, they fall into what is the greatest contradiction. And as you move across this way towards the Jahmiyyah and the philosophers, they are more consistent, right? They are more coherent in applying the philosophy and the kalam, because they are uniformly saying, we deny all names, attributes, actions for Allah, because this would imply that He is a body like the created bodies, right? So they are frank, open, apparent, and apply the principles uniformly, right? This is a coherent position on this side. And this is a coherent position on this side, the people of the Sunnah. In between, it is all contradiction, incoherent principles, and, so that's where we finished in the previous lesson number 14. I think the recording was lost, or I wasn't recorded, so I guess the first part of this lesson can be a summary of lesson 14. So lesson 15, starting from this point onwards then, we now move to the next group, and they are the Mu'tazila. So this is the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazila, they are a group of people, Amr bin Ubaid, Wasil bin Ata. These are the 2 names of the heads of the Mu'tazila, Amr bin Ubaid and Wasil bin Ata. And they were present at the beginning of the 2nd century, right? 110, 120, 130 Hijrah. They are around in the time of the Tabi'een, Al-Hasan al-Basri, and scholars of that caliber in that time. So the Mu'tazila, they had numerous deviations. One of them is in relation to Al-Qadr. One of them is in relation to the sinners from Ahlul Sunnah. Right? They have numerous deviations, but the deviation that concerns us is this deviation with respect to Allah's attributes. And they took this from the Jahmiyyah. So what is their position? The Shaykh says, الطائفة الثانية, the second group, المعتزلة ومن تبعهم من أهل الكلام وغيرهم. And they say, the second group is the Mu'tazila and whoever followed them from the people of Kalam and others. He says, وَطَرِيقَتُهُمْ أَنَّهُمْ يُثْبِتُونَ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى الْأَسْمَاء دُونَ الصِّفَاتِ. Their path is that they affirm the attributes of Allah they affirm the names of Allah as opposed to the attributes. And as for the names, they make names to be merely labels, right, devoid of meanings. And, right, so they affirm Allah's names, but they deny the attributes. They deny the attributes. And then they fall into two groups. Among them are those who say that all of these different names that belong to Allah, such as Al-Alim, Al-Qadir, Al-Sami', Al-Basir, they are actually synonymous. They are synonymous. They are all the same, right? They are just different labels pointing to the same entity, but they're actually synonymous in themselves as well, right? They're not different names. All they're doing is pointing to one entity, right? So among them are those who say that. And then there are others who say that, no, these names are actually different. Alim is different to Al-Basir, is different to As-Sami', is different to Al-Qadir. However, these names do not represent any meanings, they do not represent any attributes. Right? So in other words, Allah is As-Sami', but without having any hearing. Allah is Al-Alim, but without having any knowledge. Allah is Al-Qadir, but without having any power. So yes, these names are different, but they don't represent any meanings or any actual attributes, right? So these are two approaches amongst the Mu'tazila, right? Two approaches amongst the Mu'tazila. Because what they are trying to do is they are trying to deny the attributes. And so if you deny the attributes, then how do you deal with the names? Right? So you have to have a way of dealing with the names. And so they have two approaches. One way is to say, that these names are just all synonymous. They are mutaradifa. They're all, they're all the same basically, and they point to one essence. And the other approach is to say, well, no, the names are different, but they don't indicate any attributes. So Allah is called Al-Alim, or Al-Basir, or As-Sami', but he doesn't possess any ilm or basar or sam', right? So this is just like sophistry, really, So anyhow, that's the basic position. And the reason why they say this, why do they say this? They say because if you affirm attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you affirm attributes for Allah, then this would necessitate that Allah is a body, because we do not see in what is created anything having attributes except that it is a body, except that it is a jism. Meaning that you can't have attributes unless you have like a form, a body, And so if Allah has attributes, then we have likened him to the creation, we have rendered him to be a body. Right? This is one consideration. Another consideration is they say that, okay, if you say Allah and then the attribute of hearing and seeing and knowledge and mercy, and you say that these are eternal with Allah, then you've now affirmed multiple eternal things, and you are no different now to the Christians who say, for example, there is Allah and there is Isa alayhi salam, and then there is the Holy Spirit, which they make as part of a Trinity, and all are co-eternal, right? So they are trying to make affirmation of the attributes of Allah to be as if it is like the Trinity with the Christians. Right? And this is all sophistry and foolishness. And, so these are this is the basis upon which they deny the attributes of Allah. And ultimately, as we said, this goes back to Aristotelian metaphysics and, Neoplatonism and so on and so forth. So what is the answer? The Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, he mentions 9 responses. There are 9 responses to this falsehood. And the first of them, he says, وَالرَّدُّ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ وُجُوهٍ. The first, the response to them is from angles. First of all, first response is that Allah Ta'ala, أن الله تعالى سمى نفسه بأسماء ووصف نفسه بصفات فإن كان إثبات الصفات يستلزم التشبيه فإثبات الأسماء كذلك. This now is the contradiction, right? So just like if you remember with the Ash'aris, what's the contradiction? It is you affirm some attributes by reason and you deny other attributes because you say reason doesn't affirm those attributes, right? And we've highlighted where the contradiction is in that. You can't affirm some attributes and deny others when all of them have come in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? Here, what the Mu'tazila are doing, they're saying, okay, we'll affirm the names, but we can't affirm the attributes, right? So here's the contradiction. How can you say that affirming names for Allah is not tajseem and tashbih, which is anthropomorphism, and then say that affirming attributes is tajseem and tashbih? How can you say that? Why are you distinguishing between names and attributes? Because Allah is the one, and this is the response, Allah is the one who named himself with names. He is also the one who named himself with attributes. So how are you basically making the distinction? And if you say, well, affirming names does not necessitate likeness with created things, then likewise affirming the attributes does not necessitate likeness with created things. Right? So, this is a clear contradiction. So, by you making a distinction between the names and the attributes, then you're falling to a contradiction. So either what you should do, you should either become full men, proper men, and say, right, we deny the names and we deny the attributes. And you should be with the Jahmiyyah, right? Because that's what the Jahmiyyah do. Or you should also become full men and say, you know what, we'll affirm the names, but we'll affirm the attributes as well. And then you become full men in agreement with the people of the Sunnah. Right? So if you remember the statement of Yahya bin Ammar, what did he say? He said, the Ash'aris are the effeminates of the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila are the effeminates of the Jahmiyyah. Right? Because they're not true and real full men by virtue of the position that they hold. So this is the first point. Right? You only have 3 choices. Either you remain in this contradiction, or you deny the names and join the Jahmiyyah, which is you go on this side, you move that way, or you affirm the attributes and be consistent, and then you join the people on this side. Right? This is point number 1. Point number 2, the Shaykh says, الثاني أن الله تعالى وصف أسماءه بأنها حزنى. Allah described his names that they are beautiful, and he ordered us to make dua to him by way of them. So Allah said, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. To Allah belong the beautiful names, so invoke him by way of them. Invoke him by way of them. And this necessitates that these names must have meanings. Must have meanings. Because if Allah has ordered us to invoke him by way of these names, then these names must indicate great, tremendous meanings by which we are led to, we are led to invoke Allah, and these meanings are the basis upon which we are invoking Allah, right? So, for example, if Allah is As-Sami', the all-hearing, why else would we be invoking Allah if He did not have the attribute of hearing, so that He can hear our invocation? Why else would we be doing that? And if Allah is Ar-Rahim and Al-Ghafur, the all-merciful, the all-forgiving, and we invoke Him, why else would we be invoking Him except that He has the attribute of mercy and forgiveness? Why else would we be doing that? And why else would Allah command us to invoke Him by way of those names? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all for us. If these names were just As-Sami', Al-Basir, Al-Rahim, Al-Ghafur, Al-Ghaffar, if they were just names which are synonymous with no meanings, then what is the point in saying, oh Ghaffar, Ya Rahim, Ya Rahman? Why would we be doing that? It becomes frivolous to actually do that, right? So, and there would not be a means for us to become close to Allah and to invoke Allah and to acquire nearness to Allah and to have our supplications to be fulfilled. This would all be frivolous, and this obviously cannot be the case. This is the second point. The third point in response to the Mu'tazila is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirmed for Himself these attributes, ijmalan wa tafsilan, both general and both in detail. And He, at the same time, He negated that there is any likeness for Him. Right? So meaning, Allah is the one who affirmed for Himself names in the Quran, very clear. Allah is the one who affirmed for Himself mercy, for example, in the Quran, and wisdom in the Quran, and pleasure, ar-rida, in the Quran, and anger in the Quran. He's the one who affirmed all these attributes alongside wisdom and ilm and qudra and so on and so forth. Right? So He's the one who affirmed these two for Himself. And then He said, after all of that, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest example. And He said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. So if Allah is the one who affirmed these names and attributes on the one hand, and then on the other He denied there's any likeness, then if what you are saying, that affirming the attributes is tamthil and tashbih and tajseem, then this would be a contradiction in the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because He's the one who affirmed the attributes, and He's the one who said, Laysa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing which is a likeness unto Him. Right? This would necessitate that there is a contradiction within the speech of Allah, if what you are saying is correct. And also implied within that as well, obviously, is like it's as if they are saying that Allah did not know somehow that affirming attributes for Himself is tajseem and tashbih, and that He would be misguiding the people who receive the Quran and confusing them by affirming attributes for Himself. Like, there's so many evil implications that are present when you hold on to these views and these positions. So the third point in response is that it is Allah Himself who explicitly affirmed attributes for Himself, whether it is life and hearing and will and seeing and speech, meaning the 7 that the Ash'aris affirm, or the other attributes like His wisdom and His mercy and His pleasure and His love and so on and so forth, whether those attributes. And at the same time He said, Laysa kamithlihi shay. So either there is a contradiction in the kalam, in the book of Allah, or you are upon falsehood. Right? Point number 4, I believe now, I think that was the third one. Point number 4 now is that whoever أن من لا يتصف بصفات الكمال لا يصلح أن يكون ربا ولا إلها. That the one who is not described with any attributes, then he is not worthy of being a Lord nor a deity. Neither a Lord nor a deity. And for this reason the Shaykh says, وَلِهَذَا عَابَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ أَبَاهُ بِاتِّخَاذِهِ مَا لَا يَسْمَعُ وما لا يبصر إلها فقال يا أبت لما تعبد ما لا يسمع ولا يبصر ولا يغني عنك شيئا. So the Shaykh says, the one who is not described with any attributes, then that is not befitting to be a Lord or a deity. And for this reason we find that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he criticized his father because his father took as a deity that which does not hear nor does it see. And that's why he mentioned the ayah in the Quran, Surah Maryam, the 19th chapter, verse number 42, in which Allah Azza wa Jal, he says, mentioning about Ibrahim, that he said to his father, "O my father, why do you worship that which does not hear and does not see and cannot avail you of anything?" So this shows that hearing and seeing must be the attributes of one that is deserving of worship. Right, so therefore, if you, the Mu'tazila, if you say Allah has no hearing, seeing, wisdom, mercy, forgiveness, and all the other, attributes, he doesn't possess any attributes whatsoever, then how can he be worthy of worship? Right? It's precisely because Allah is described with the most beautiful names and the lofty attributes that he is worthy of worship. It's precisely because of that, and that he's unique in that. So how can you deny this? And as you can see, as we go through these points regarding all of these groups, you can now start to understand and see how the effect of these doctrines, these beliefs, this creed, and this philosophy is to slowly and step by step to strip the people of their iman and of their worship. Right? Can you see the implications, right? If Allah does not love, if Allah does not become pleased, if Allah does not become angry, then how are you as a believer? How are you then affected in your actions? Right? If you know that Allah does not love and Allah does not become pleased, does not become angry. Right? And similarly, if you as a Mu'tazili, you deny that, these attributes, that Allah hears and sees and becomes pleased and angry, again, the same thing. Right? What are you doing? You are removing the meanings from the hearts of the people through which they worship their Lord and become closer to their Lord. And that's why the Salaf were very, very severe against these people. Right? Because this is exactly what they said. They said these people, they strip Iman from the hearts of the servants of Allah. And also because, as we said also, that this eventually leads to atheism. If you were to follow the principles and apply them consistently and coherently, then you would be forced to eventually agree with the Jahmiyyah and then the philosophers that basically, the maker or the creator is nothing more than a concept in the mind, a concept of oneness in the mind only. Right? This is where you would be forced to retreat if you were to be rationally coherent in applying this philosophy, properly, and to follow it through, coherently. So this was point number 4. By stripping Allah of attributes, you are basically making him unworthy of worship. Right? And the proof for that is the statement of Ibrahim alayhi salam, what he said to his father. Point number 5, or response number 5, is that أن كل موجود لا بد له من صفة ولا يمكن وجود ذات مجردة عن الصفات. Every existing thing must have an attribute. Every existing thing has to have at least one attribute, otherwise it does not exist. And it is not possible for any essence, any being to exist without having any attributes. This is simply not possible. Everything in existence must have at least one attribute. And in fact, existence is one of them. Does Allah exist? Yes, He exists. There's one attribute, right? And then there's obviously whatever other attributes that are additional to that. So the Shaykh says, therefore, it is necessary that the Creator, whose existence, is necessary, He must be described with attributes that are befitting Him, that befit Him. Absolutely must be described with attributes that befit Him. So this is point number 5. And as the Shaykh says, every existence has attributes, and there's nothing in existence except that it must have attributes. Even things like, if you say, the night is long, or the night is not something which is an actual body. It's not something like tangible, but you can say the night is long, and you can say the day is short, and you can say, there's things you can say, but everything must have an attribute. This is point number 5. Point number 6, in refutation of the Mu'tazila, is that when they say that the names of Allah are just mere labels, and all they do is indicate Allah's being and His essence without representing any meanings, right? So what they are saying is, yes, there is, Allah is Alim, Allah is Sami', Allah is Basir, right? So these are different labels pointing to the same essence. In fact, it's a bit like this. If you have, like a man, there's Abdullah, and Abdullah is generous, he is Jawad, and he is Kareem. He is, these are names, right? These are his names. We call him the Jawad, the Kareem, the strong, the Qawi. And so we give him these names, but he is not generous at all. No generosity. And he's not strong at all. He's actually quite weak. And he's not noble at all. He's ignoble, right? So the names that he has are stripped of any meanings and truth. And so all we are left with is just labels attached to that person that only really represent his being, right? Devoid of any attributes. And obviously this can happen in the creation. This can be true in the creation. Someone can be called Abdullah, like the pagan Arabs used to be called before Islam, but they were polytheists and disbelievers, right? They are slaves of, or they are worshippers of dead righteous men, or whatever it might be. And you can have someone called Al-Jawad, but he's not Jawad. You can have someone called, all sorts of names, but they are not what the names indicate. Obviously, this is for the creation. But what they are trying to say, that Allah is called As-Sami' without having any hearing. Allah is called Al-Qadir without having any power, right? And this is the sophistry. So what the Shaykh is saying here is that, this is point number 6, that this statement of yours, that these names of Allah are all synonymous and all they do is point to the essence of Allah without providing any additional meanings, this is completely futile and false. Because the evidences of the Quran and the Sunnah are plentiful in showing that every name of Allah has its own separate specific meaning. Every name of Allah has its own separate specific meaning, even if at the same time it indicates the essence of Allah. So yes, each name does indicate the essence of Allah, but it also indicates the specific meaning that name indicates, right? So in other words, what we are saying here is, when we say Allah is Al-Alim, Al-Sami', Al-Basir, Al-Qadir, these are 4 names. And these names do 2 things. The first thing that the name does is it indicates the being or the essence to which it belongs. Right? So this is the essence of Allah, the being of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And secondly, the name indicates the meaning, the unique meaning, which in this case is hearing, and which in that case is seeing, and which in that case is knowledge, and which in that case is power. Right? So Allah Azza wa Jal mentioned these names in order to afford these individual specific meanings. So He said in the Quran, for example, that He is Al-Hayy, the ever-living, and He is As-Sami' and Al-Basir, and He is Al-Alim, Al-Qadir. Right? So the one being described is the one and the same, but the descriptions are individual and separate. Right? So Allah has many names, Allah has many attributes. And Allah would not have mentioned that in the Quran. Why did Allah mention all these names in the Quran then? So the Shaykh mentions a verse here at the end of Surah Al-Hashr, in which Allah says, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa hu. He is Allah, besides whom there is none worthy of worship. Then He said, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, Al-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir. He mentioned 8 names. Right. So if what the Mu'tazila are saying is correct, it would mean, why has Allah Azza wa Jal needlessly mentioned all these names when really all Allah is saying, when really all Allah is saying is, Hu Allah, He is Allah, Alladhi la ilaha illahu, besides whom there is no deity worthy of worship except He. Al-Malik, it should really say Allah, 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 Allah 8 times. Like, in essence, that's what you are saying that Allah is saying, that because all of these names, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, Al-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir, these are all actually the same as each other. They are synonymous. Right? If that was the case, then it's as if Allah is really saying that Allahu alladhi, Hu Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, Allah, 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 8 times. Well, that's what you're saying that Allah is saying. And that Al-Malik doesn't have its own meaning. The king. Al-Quddus, the sanctified one. As-Salam, the grantor of peace, and the one free from any deficiencies. Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, and so on and so forth. Right? So this, we can clearly see this is completely futile. And if all of these names were basically synonymous, then Allah would not have mentioned them. There would be no benefit in repeating something 8 times which has the same purpose. Why do that? It's frivolity. So as you can now start to see, when you try to engage in this philosophy and use it as a basis for acquiring your belief, you are going to now start to commit crimes against the revelation, the text of revelation. And you are going to, play with these texts and make mockery, in a way, of these texts, which is what we can clearly see, is what is implied by these positions of the Mu'tazila. Point number 7, in refutation of their rejection of the attributes, is that this statement that they say, Allah is Alim, He has the name Alim, but without knowledge. Allah is Qadir, but without power. And Allah is As-Sami', but without hearing. This is the most futile of statements. This is قول باطل مخالف لمقتضى اللسان العربي وغير العربي. This is speech that it violates the Arabic language and in fact every other language. Why is that? Because as the Shaykh says, فَإِنَّ مِنَ الْمَعْلُومِ فِي لُغَاتِ جَمِيعِ الْعَالَمِ أَنَّ الْمُشْتَقْ دَالٌ عَلَى الْمَعْنَى الْمُشْتَقْ مِنْهُ. Now what the Shaykh is pointing here is that okay, so Allah's name of all-powerful is derived from his attribute of power. When we say Allah is Al-Qadir, that can only be if he has the attribute of power. There's no other way that you have a name unless there's an actual attribute. So the name Al-Qadir is mushtaq, is derived from the attribute of power. So how can you say we affirm Al-Qadir, which is the derived thing, and then deny Allah's power, Qudra, which is the thing which is from that which it is derived? Do you understand? It's like, it's impossible. Because Allah's name Al-Qadir or As-Sami or Al-Basir, these are names derived from the attribute. So if you now say, well, we affirm the name but not the attribute, well, the name itself is derived from the very attribute. How can you affirm the name and negate the attribute? It doesn't make any sense. Right? This violates just language. The principles of language, it violates language. It does not make any sense. And, you know, and we know this even if we know, for example, that someone, we say, you know, about some of the companions, for example, Abdullah bin Umar, radiallahu anhu, from the most generous of the companions in giving his wealth and freeing slaves and so on and so forth, and not staying in the house with wealth, you know, before distributing it. If we were to say about Abdullah bin Umar, radiallahu anhu, by way of example, that he is generous, kareem and jawad, and we say, no, this is only the label, he has no attribute of you know, Jude and so on and so forth. How does that even make sense? Because we only called him the generous by virtue of the attribute that was established with him of being generous. Right? So this is completely nonsensical, and it violates the basic principles in language. Right? That the title is derived from the attribute that affords that title. So if you affirm the title but deny the attribute, then this is just, you know, contradiction, and it is foolishness. And so the Shaykh says, وَأَنَّهُ لَا يُمْكِنْ أَن يُقَالْ عَلِيمٌ لِمَنْ لَا عِلْمَ لَهُ وَلَا قَدِيرٌ لِمَنْ لَا قُدْرَ لَهُ. This is impossible. You can't say to someone knowledgeable who has no knowledge, and to someone powerful who has no power, and to someone hearing who has no hearing. Right? So all of this is simply not possible. So this shows that all of these names, they indicate the attributes which befit Allah's majesty, and, you know, it is futile to affirm the names and to deny the attributes. It's possible. Point number 8 is their argument that it is not possible to find anything described with attributes except that it is a body. This is the principle upon which they are operating, right? لا يوجد شيء متصف بالصفات إلا جسم. Nothing is found which is described with anything except that it is a body. And the Shaykh says, this we don't agree. This principle of yours is prohibited, and, you know, we don't agree with it because we find things that can be described, but they are not bodies, as you may understand. So the Shaykh says, for example, فَإِنَّهُ يُقَالْ لَيْلٌ طَوِيلٌ. لَيْلٌ طَوِيلٌ. A long night. The night is long. Long here is an attribute or a description of the night. But the night isn't like a physical body or a thing. Yet it can still be described with an attribute. And وَنَهَارٌ قَصِيرٌ. And a short day. The day is not necessarily, it's not like an entity, but we can describe it as being short. وَبَرْدٌ شَدِيد. Cold. Severe cold. Severity as an attribute of cold. وَحَرٌ خَفِيف. Like light warmth, and similar things. And so all of these, none of these are understood to be a jism according to their definition. The people of Kalam, they have a number of different definitions of what they call a jism. Some of them say it means anything which has spatial direction, anything which has extension, like this. They have different definitions for what is a jism. And these things don't enter into that definition, yet they are still ascribed attributes and descriptions. So this principle you are operating upon, we don't agree with it, it is false, right? It is not, because not everything that has an attribute has to be a body as opposed to what you claim, right? So the Shaykh says that all of these are, none of these are bodies according to your definition. And at the same time, we do not accept that we can ascribe to Allah that He is a body or not a body, right? Because this is innovated philosophical language. We don't say Allah is a jism, nor do we say Allah is not a jism, because this is not the language of the Quran, nor is it the language of the prophets and messengers. This is something that has come from the misguided philosophers, right? So it is an innovation. It is innovation and misguidance to say Allah is a body, Allah is a jism. And it is also an innovation and misguidance to say Allah is not a body, Allah is not a jism. And we don't enter into any of this type of speech, because this speech is not found in the Quran or the Sunnah. So, but the reason why these people say Allah is not a body, which is ambiguous speech, is in order to help them deny the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is why they use this type of language. These people of Kalam, they use this innovative language because it's a stepping stone to that end. The final point, the last and final point, is when they say Al-Ajsam Mutamathila. Al-Ajsam Mutamathila. They have this argument, they say that all the bodies in creation, they are like each other. They are all exactly the same, right? So this is going a bit deep into their philosophy now, because like into atomism, and which they took from Democritus and others from the Greek philosophers. This idea that everything breaks down to an indivisible particle, and all those indivisible particles are identical. They're all the same. The only thing that makes each thing different is the attributes, right? So for example, they say what fire is made of, what water is made of, what steel is made of. All of these are indivisible particles. They are actually identical, right? And the only thing that makes water to be water and fire to be fire and steel to be steel is the actual a'rad, are the attributes of each thing, right? And they also say, this is their view as well, that Allah does not create anything new. Allah does not bring anything new into the creation. Rather, all these individual particles that He created, they are all created once, right? And all He does is change the attributes of each thing to make it basically different and to change its state and so on and so forth. Anyhow, this is some of the deeper aspect of their kalam. And what they mean when they say al-ajsam mutamathila, they are saying that all bodies are made up of identical particles, right? So therefore, if something has an attribute, it must be a body, and all bodies are the same, right? So if you say Allah has an attribute, therefore Allah must be a body like the created bodies, right? It's the same argument that we've been through before. However, the answer to that is this claim that all bodies are identical in terms of what they are made of. It is false. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he refuted this claim. And we know the Shaykh gives some examples. He says, look, we know, for example, that butter is not the same as a rock, and like a sponge is not the same as lead, and water is not the same as fire. We know that all of these essences are basically, they are different, and the actual thing of which they are made is also different in each case. It's not as what these people are claiming, right? There's different things, different essences that make up the different. Just as we know that the jinn are made of a certain essence, the angels are made of a certain essence, we are made of a certain essence, right? They are not identical, they are not actually identical particles. So anyhow, this is like a deeper part of their philosophy which they use in order to deny the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this principle itself is factually speaking, it is actually not correct. Right? And this idea, they took it from the Greek philosophers like Democritus and others, who basically said back in that time that everything reduces down to one identical individual particle. Right? So everything in the creation is made up of the same individual identical particles. It is only the a'rad which are basically altered and changed and so on and so forth. Anyhow, this brings us to an end of the refutation of the Mu'tazila, who affirm the names and deny the attributes. This is a blatant contradiction. You simply can't do that from so many different angles and from so many different ways that the Shaykh mentioned. So I think upon that note we can conclude our lesson there for today, inshallah. And in the next lesson we're going to move to the next column or the next group, and they are the Jahmiyyah in this column here. Inshallah, we look at their, and as you'll see, as you go further and further, their statements become more and more absurd. Right? They become more and more absurd, and you start asking, how on earth did these people even get into this? How would you get caught up in this nonsense? Right? Even though these are apparently shrewd and intelligent people. Right? So inshallah we'll be looking at that in the next lesson, which will be in the after the in the new year, inshallah ta'ala. So on that note we'll conclude our lesson there for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.